So I'm extremely grateful to chair this particular session on critical and emerging technologies. The title is fairly interesting. It is Power, Access and Equity. So we are looking at multiple dimensions of critical and emerging technologies. So to speak in this panel, we have 5 distinguished speakers. One is Roshni Raj, Policy Research Associate, Synergia Foundation, Bangalore. The second is Jalak Kaka, Executive Director, Center for Communication Governance, National University, New Delhi. Abhivardhan is Mr. Abhivardhan, the founder and chairperson, Indian Society of Artificial Intelligence, Lucknow, and we have Meghna Bal, Director, SAS Center, New Delhi. So this is, the one good thing about this session is that there are too many lawyers in this session. So I'm also a lawyer, but I'm not a technology lawyer. So when you think about this sector, we have heard about this term, critical technologies. It is very important, and we know that every country is actually in the race to be the leader in critical technologies. So be it artificial intelligence, quantum computing, chip manufacturing, whatever. Every country wants to be the leader in this area. But the problem is that 2 countries in particular have actually taken some kind of a leadership. So based upon the recent data, out of the 10 major technology companies, 9 are actually from the United States or China. And there is only one company which is outside both these countries, which is from the European Union. And no developing country has got a global leader in this particular space. The second important point is that the emerging and critical technologies are extremely important for economic security. They are extremely important for development, but at the same time, they are also very important for national security. No wonder many countries are coming up with various categories of restrictions. The United States has got restrictions on export controls on this kind of technologies flowing into other countries. The European Union has also measures. Many countries have come up with export restrictions, and in order to be a leader in this particular race, many countries are actually granting huge amount of state subsidies or state bounties for that matter. Most of you might have heard about the Chips and Science Act in the United States, and also the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. And importantly, in order to power these industries, we need some of the very rare inputs and raw materials like gallium, antimony, molybdenum, tungsten, so many products. And we know that China has got more than 70% production of some of these critical and rarer products. So in a way, the battle has only started. Who will actually control the future of the critical and emerging technologies is left to be seen. But the important point is that no one can actually ignore this area. Even a developing country like India has got huge stakes in this area. So if you really want to power your semiconductor industry, your EV battery production, your automotive sector in the future, these technologies are extremely important. But at the same time, this particular panel has also brought in the access dimension. So if AI is going to be the defining technology of the future, how will access be guaranteed? And how will it take into account the safety, the security, the personal liberty, and the rights of individuals? That is again a major concern. And human beings also have got the anxiety. What will happen to us in the future? If these kind of technologies have got this kind of a disruptive power, what will happen to human jobs? Even the lawyers, you never know whether we will all be rendered redundant in the next 10 years' time. And that may happen to many of the professions as well. So I do not really want to actually give my version of what will happen to the power, access and equity in this particular debate. So let me turn to Roshni Raj, Policy Associate, Synergia Foundation.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests. I thank you, ORF Foundation, for inviting me to this conference. I'd like to talk about how the world has danced with different world orders, as we know. It was agrarian once upon a time, then we've moved, security has been underlying, but we've moved to economic, and now we've jumped into a new technopolar era. And this technopolar era is where emerging and critical technologies are the ones that are going to decide what and who has the power, who has the access and the equity among nations. For centuries, power was measured with territory, it was measured with population, it was measured with demographic, etc. But now what we're seeing is that algorithmic control and tech is the new power definer. So the question is no longer whether technology is going to intervene, define what the future holds for us, because that is inevitable. The question is, who will control it? Piggybacking on what Sir said, who will control it, who will benefit, and who decides who has the control? With respect to the geopolitics of emerging technologies, we are seeing that two biggest players, China and the US, are monopolizing artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, and even defense manufacturing. Recently, Synergia Foundation, we conducted a workshop with the Naval War College in Goa, and we realized that within the Naval War College itself, autonomous weapons are becoming a paramount importance and a paramount interest. Whether it is autonomous systems, robotics, hypersonics, directed energy weapons, all of these systems are using AI, are needing latest developments in technology in AI itself. We've seen that countries like Israel is already using AI in its defense operations, like autonomous systems like Gospel, Lavender, Where's Daddy is being used against Hamas operations. And even the US is secretly working on different projects with autonomous systems. But with power being such an important definition, an important quotient, what does the human factor do with autonomous, and how does machine learning differentiate human learning? That's what I'd like to touch a little bit about. The advantages that AI has over human beings is that it does not require a lot of land. It requires data, and it's constantly collecting this data from every single one of us, whether it's Google or any of the giants, Meta, OpenAI, Alibaba, Tesla. All of these are studying human beings, our behaviors, our understanding of what we like, what we dislike, and this is information that gets converted into power. What we're also seeing is a fracturing of the global technological order that was set up because the US and China are having their own little competition, whether it's AI, semiconductors, and in a way, with US putting so much of restrictions on Chinese semiconductors and autonomous weapons, AI, etc., is the US enabling China in becoming a little bit more independent and self-reliant? Is another question that I thought I'd throw some light on. Is China countering US's hegemonic policies by the digital Silk Road, and how far that has come about? We are yet to see. We've already seen the situation with OpenAI being completely shattered by DeepSeek. It was a very tragic situation for OpenAI, but also goes to show how much China is developing in its own tech fundamentals and infrastructure. It also shows that the world is going to have options. We're no more going to only rely on OpenAI as the only AI source. China is also made DeepSeek open, so we're going to have options, especially for emerging countries in the global south. Reports from the World Economic Forum, from McKinsey and Company, MIT Technology Review, states that the global south, countries in the global south are going to be very seriously affected by this technological gap that's being created by the global north and the global south. And we're already seeing that because around 60 to 65% of the population in the global north have access to technology, whereas 20 to 23% in the global south have access to technology. Even citizens in the global south are still using 2G, 3G technology, whereas China is talking about 6G technology at the moment. There is a very big skill gap that is being identified in the global south. Younger generations are not having access to the emerging technologies, resources, and academia that one would have in the global south, in the global north, pardon me. And then there is a data dependence that the global south has on the global north, which needs to reduce, the gap needs to reduce, but we're not sure exactly how to do it. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia face barriers in even accessing these data, whereas these data from these nations are being absorbed by data miners and used for testing, intelligence, surveillance by companies and organizations in the global north. So I'd like to just ask the question, in the future, will AI serve humanity or will humanity serve us? I think that's a very important question that we ask, because at this point, technology is interlinked in all our lives, and how are we going to detach from it or work with it is a very important question. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Roshni. I think I was a bit unfair. You could have spoken for another 1 minute, but anyway. So I think she highlighted two important issues. One is basically that there is a difference between machine learning and human learning. And when machines actually start to learn at a much faster and more efficient rate than humans can, it can also lead to, certain powers of companies. And already there is actually talk about tech oligarchs and other things. So it can further, accentuate the problem. The second issue which you mentioned about is that there is no harmonization. So, there are two hemispheres that may be forming in the future. One is actually the hemisphere that is spearheaded by the United States and allies, and the second may be by China and the partners of the Belt and Road initiatives. So that is it actually going to be beneficial? Some people are of the opinion that if the United States come up with all categories of restrictions and other kinds of embargo on China can be maximum 6 months behind. So is it really going to help the humanity or the international, the global, geopolitical or economic order for that matter? Very interesting, takeaways. So let me now turn to Janak for her views on this issue.
Thank you. And thanks to ORF for inviting me for this. There's a really interesting issue at stake with the emergence of artificial intelligence. Some of the issues are old issues that we've seen with even the dominance of social media, its concentration in the West, implications in global South and global majority countries, issues such as disinformation, which erodes public trust in democratic institutions and processes. And of course, AI also throws up a whole host of new issues. I think, one of the questions that this panel is seeking to engage with is what challenges democracies encounter in managing the dual nature of these technologies, both in terms of progress as well as a source of instability. And I think we are, embracing the way artificial intelligence can serve progress, economic progress, social progress, in the way governments can leverage it for more effective, distribution of welfare schemes. But I think one of the things we are shying away from is really engaging head-on with the sort of harms that we can see from the use of such emerging technologies, whether it is individual level harms or it is societal level harms. And I think one of the lessons to learn from the last wave of internet technology, and one of the key sort of examples over there being social media and other internet platforms, is that we should learn lessons from what went down over there, whether it is data harvesting or it is really the virality of information, challenges of disinformation, which have impacted, EU elections. It has impacted US elections. So it's not only impacting the global South, but we've seen this impacting, Western democracies as well. So I think one of the things we need to sort of put a pin on and be thinking about as we leverage these technologies is what are the societal and individual level harms, and how can we be mindful from the get-go in the design of these technologies. And because, the way you design the foundational layer of these technologies creates a lot of function creep and path dependencies going forward. It becomes very difficult to go back and undo what has really been done, and then regulation can only tinker and band-aid the challenges you're seeing rather than upend the whole ecosystem and fix. So I think that's sort of one piece that I want to talk about is we have to be mindful that with any benefit, there are also negative consequences. And, from the get-go, let's not only think about benefits, but let's think about how we can learn lessons from the past to reduce the impact of these negative consequences. I think when we're talking about nations breaking the gridlock amongst major powers to promote enhanced global cooperation and tech development, one of the things that the previous panel was talking about was more cooperation between the Asia Pacific. And I think one of the things that we need to do as a country is really build that cooperation across the Indo-Pacific and leverage those relationships to effectively participate in standards discussions. Because I think that is one fora where we are not paying enough attention. And I think the question with emerging technologies in terms of governance, ethics, the real game is actually in standards conversations and how those are getting shaped. In the global context, we've seen that countries like China seem to be dominating those discussions. They have large contingents of experts, very well resourced, who go and participate in these discussions. And standards may seem sort of neutral and technical, but they do embed various social values as well. And they are socio-technical in many ways. So I think, we need to, as a country, be investing a lot of time and energy and resource in facilitating industry, civil society, academia, enhancing their capacity and ability to participate in these discussions, as well as providing financial support to enable this. And also building coalitions across the Indo-Pacific, where we can, as a bloc, be better placed to negotiate and push common values of openness, transparency, democratic values together into the framing of these standards. And I think in terms of what role the Global South can play in promoting the equitable use of technology, I think one of the things that sort of gets lost is the fact that, of course, we all know that a lot of the compute infrastructure is sort of is very centered in the United States, in countries like China. And these solutions, AI applications, are being developed in those contexts. Now, for instance, a health application that's developed at Sloan Kettering in the United States to say scan for a particular disease and identify it, is developed using keeping in mind the high resource medical infrastructure over there, the kind of tests that can be done over there, the sort of data inputs over there. If you just blindly translate into a low resource context like India, where even, tertiary healthcare centers in semi-urban areas may not have the kind of tests available. It's a completely different demographic of individuals, genetic pool. Very often you're seeing blind adoption of these technologies without adequate testing and safety evaluation. So I think one of the things is we have to give impetus to not only indigenous development of AI technologies that are contextualized to the Indian context. But we also have to see that when technologies are being sort of imported from, other context, high resource context, what kind of systems and evaluation, safety benchmarks, we are undertaking before they are deployed in the Indian context. Right now, that's a big question mark. So I think, and the last point in terms of global South countries promoting equitable use of technologies is countries like India. We have the India AI mission that is trying to push forward a lot of indigenous AI development and capacity building. And AI technologies and applications we're developing within the Indian context, we should thoughtfully be helping, leverage that in other global South contexts, while being cognizant that the global South is not one homogeneous entity, and there are different contextual realities in different countries. And like I was cautioning, the transfer and application of, say, a health application developed in the United States and the challenges that may arise in India, there could be similar challenges that arise from, movement of Indian developed AI applications to other global South countries. But I think, it will be more contextual than something that is perhaps developed in, the Western world. So I think it's a combination of coming in at the layer of technology development, at the layer of standards development, as well as really thinking about how our economy, our people are being leveraged for data, for minerals and resources, for labor, for data annotation, and how can we safeguard the way our country, our resources are being used as inputs into the global AI ecosystem.
Thank you, Jalaga. You touched upon very, very important issues. Basically, you argued that the AI actually throws open a range of issues. Most of them are basically ethical issues. And one important distinguishing hallmark of a human being is that we have got an ethical function. We can decide what is actually good and what is bad. And that is actually the function of the law as well. Any kind of a regulation will have to find or should be found on the principle of no harm. How these kind of regulations can actually affect individual liberties, values, the cornerstone principles of democracy, etc. And you also touched upon the other elements like, that the AI systems or the technologies which may be developed in other countries cannot be transplanted into our systems. We need to have our own indigenous way of developing AI. And you also talk about the importance of standardization, how standards can actually play a very, very important role. And the standard setting format will also be dependent upon the various categories of coalitions. It can happen at a bilateral level, it can happen among regional groupings, it can happen in multilateral level as well. And you also spoke about the need for South-South cooperation for that matter, especially within the Asia-Pacific countries. So a range of issues. I don't think that we can find answers to any of these issues in a quick time, but it is important to brainstorm these matters. So let me now turn to Abhivardhan.
Well, it's a pleasure to be speaking here at the behest of, the invitation by the Observer Research Foundation, and I express my gratitude for that. In fact, I'm actually elated to see that this is a very diverse ITTF this year. We have representation from underrated cities like Lucknow, Udaipur, and so many. So that's one shout out. But taking into the context of what is being discussed today about AI regulation, AI standardization, issues around innovation, is that what's happening is, of course, unprecedented. And it's not necessarily about the way the trajectory of AI itself as a technology is. You see, there are multiple use cases of AI in multiple sectors that just pop up. They just come up and they slow down. It's like a sine wave in some way or the other. Some of the use cases sustain, like if you look at the generative AI side of it, of course, a lot of AI tools are good in productivity. So a regulatory or governance perspective, or let us say even a adjudicatory perspective, let us not even say regulation, because when we take the global south in context, a lot of countries might not be even ready to regulate because there's a whole set of issues when it comes to capacity building. So previous year, we did an experiment. I drafted something called AI Act.in, and we did that amidst the fact when the October 2023 expert report of India AI mission came in, the very first report, which was very important from AI skills perspective, semiconductors perspective, and even non-personal data and related things. We figured out one thing, that when you discuss perspectives of risk, incident responses, these are like the most immediate issues when it comes to AI risk and AI regulation. There is some coherence among end users and business end users as a matter of feedback which we received. So there is, of course, a sense, and I'm talking about the Indian audiences here to clarify. So when we look at the global south as a matter of inspiration, and we see that India is a leader of the global south and a very important nodal actor of the Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Abrahamic also, I believe that capacity building measures matter a lot. Just recently, a day ago, we received, everyone knows this, that the Ministry of Finance issued a particular document stating that Government of India employees should not use tools like DeepSeek and ChatGPT. Now, this is similar, not kind of similar, but kind of relatable to, let us say, the way when a lot of Chinese apps were restricted from use, like Cam Scanner, TikTok, and all those. So when we look at the power quotient of AI, one thing we need to understand is that, of course, the innovation cycle of AI matters a lot, because when we get into these discussions of regulation, of course, there are some impending risks in certain sectors like health, I would say, data transfer issues, cross-border issues, which are really critical. And countries in the Indo-Pacific and the global south should be concerned about it, which reminds me of the fact how global south democracies look at these issues. But then at the same time, I think there's a lot to be understood when it comes to market adoption, because if you look at India as an exemplar, because India is a bigger player in the global south and an inspiration also for a lot of countries in, say, West Asia, Africa, and otherwise, and even Southeast Asia, I think market dynamics with respect to AI and analytics needs to be understood and corrected. Like what happened to NVIDIA because of DeepSeek is not because NVIDIA was hyping it up. So I'm speaking more from a competition law point of view as well. What happened with NVIDIA was that the retail investors were worried that something which is more resourceful as DeepSeek R1 has come. Well, interestingly, the code and the training data is not open source, only the model is. But what DeepSeek showed is that there's a sense of resourcefulness which could be achieved by not hyping up about layers of resources when it comes to cloud, when it comes to compute, when it comes to other things. So NVIDIA achieved the innovations it could. I don't think NVIDIA should be blamed for it. It's more around the other stakeholders whose hyped up impact affected one company and other companies accordingly. O3 Mini's cost has been reduced. You can use O3 Mini, maybe in future O3 Mini High, as they call, as Sam Altman calls it, on Perplexity. If you use these tools, of course, some of it are good in productivity, some of it good for AI workflows. I'll not call that they are at the level of AI agents yet because they're pretty ineffective. But how does it affect the power gap? Well, I think it affects the power gap because then some rumblings are happening in India as well. We have Sarvam AI, we have one company I'm naming, and there are many other companies, right? Even in robotics, we have Orangewood, we have other entities which are working. In the data center side, we have Yotta. So the market understanding is very essential. because the market is burgeoning, again, the costs, inflation will be affected, so that it won't inflate a lot at many levels. I think these issues will also echo when it comes to a lot of global south countries. So taking India as a very important exemplar for the larger Indo-Pacific and for the larger global south, I think we should look at market practices, see what can be adjudicated soon when it comes to especially third-party AI, and when it comes to in the risk side incident responses. I think this is one of the most direct things which we can do. But of course, there are other things which are associated around safe harbor as well, but that's maybe, I think, a problem for major countries, except maybe China, who have not been able to figure out the safe harbor problems around AI that well. So, do you have a minute?
Yeah, please.
Sure. So, I think that needs to be seen, because the feedback on the bill which we received, it was a draft bill which we had, AIAct.in, was that people were able to relate with certain risk categories, while there were certain things which were not relatable. You can look at actually the European Union's AI liability guidelines, the recent one published just a few days ago. It's like 200 pages long. But if you look at some of the definitions, they kind of don't make sense with the market scenario also. But that does not mean that there are no technical risks. I think the thing is, we need to differentiate between what is an automation and an AI agent as a market. I'm talking about the market perspective. We need to understand that an AI workflow is not the same as an AI agent or an automation. I think these things matter a lot for a market which is coming up, both for business end users and end users. So to some extent, so I'll pause it here, but I'll add later.
Thank you, Abhimandan, for bringing in that market dynamics into picture. And the term that you used is actually adjudication and not regulation. That is also a very important distinction. So now let me turn to the last speaker of today, Meghna Bhatt. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I want to start with the fact that it's not a zero-sum game between the global north and the global south, and typically rhetoric around AI development is presented in that fashion, and I don't understand why. Well, I do. I think it's because there's a lack of empirics on what is happening in India, and Abhinandan touched upon it. And we've done a lot of studies on this front. So let's start with, I want to go a little back into the context of development or certain facets of at least the US economy and how they contribute to technology development. One is the Small Business Innovation Research Program. That is basically a government investment program that funds startups and small businesses. And the extent of funding is pretty amazing, because they're even willing to fund projects that take a concept from impossible to merely plausible, which means that absolute moonshots are something that the US government is willing to fund on the off chance that they, are able to essentially lead the way or invest in some kind of frontier technology that's not being looked at elsewhere. Now let's compare to what the government is doing here and what startups we've spoken to have indicated to us in terms of government. There's two considerations. The first is access to data, which again, I don't know why we keep obsessing with American companies. Most and a lot of the data that Indian companies need is available with the government. A lot of it is not accessible. I'll give you one example. We did a study on AI startups working in agriculture. All of them need data from the government in some way, shape, or form. For instance, there's one startup that works on livestock management, and there's a government program called Bharat Pashudhan, which essentially is a unique ID system for livestock, and it has a lot of data about breeds, about genetic varieties, etc., etc. None of that data is made available to startups. Another form of government data, so there's a lot of satellite imaging that's important, that's used for AI weather recommendations and things like that. Again, yes, some of that data is private satellite data, but some of it is also ISRO data, too expensive, inaccessible. So I think we need to consider the fact that the government is the largest data fiduciary in the country, and that it is incumbent on them first to make data available. And it's not only a thing about inaccessible databases. The databases that are accessible, the data is not clean, it's not usable, it's incomplete, you don't know if it's accurate. One good example is Enam, which again, these AI agri-tech startups indicated to us, was data that they need. They need real-time market prices. But Enam is a colossal failure, and it's a colossal failure because it's not in touch with the reality on the ground. It was an absolute non-starter, right? That, I mean, it was there in the report of the committee on doubling agricultural income, that in some mandis the enam infrastructure computers had not even been unwrapped. In other mandis, either if there was too much rush, they would just ignore it completely, or they'd update the system with old data, so on and so forth. So that is one consideration. The other consideration is that very often what happens is the government starts entering these markets, and once there's a government company or a company that's backed by the government in any way that enters the markets, it becomes a huge problem for other startups. It becomes impossible for them, for instance, to have access to tenders, which is a good way for startups to be able to access different markets, particularly startups that are working on development solutions. So for instance, one startup told us, and this is separate from the AI and Agritech study that we did, one startup indicated to us that basically Bhashini is mentioned in almost every government tender. So where do we stand a chance? If this startup has already kind of been given the market, then where do we stand a chance in entering? And the other consideration, of course, with public procurement is the fact that L1 is still kind of the norm, which means that the lowest bidder wins out. Impossible for startups to compete, right? So if we're talking about competitiveness and we're talking about it, let's start looking at home for like a little bit closer to home before we start looking at, global countries that have very different contexts. And if we are going to talk about, the US, then we should talk about things like small business innovation research, where the government is investing in ideas that may not reach or amount to anything, but it's still willing to take the chance because it has a greater risk appetite and it has a public interest function than, let's say, a VC would, which would want some kind of return on investment, right? So that's one consideration. The other consideration is, and this is based on another study that we've done, is how the market is working right now. And I think before we think about that, we need to think about the fact that AI is not a monolith. It's a very heterogeneous technology. And again, Abhivardhan touched upon it. There are multiple types of models, even in terms of size of model. There is a debate on whether large language models are really the frontier or whether it's better to go with a smaller model. And it completely depends on what your business wants to do. And there is a scale paradox as well with AI, whereas the bigger the model it gets, the more unpredictable the outcomes become. And, and then the more problematic it is in terms of working with and fine-tuning and all of that. Anyway, so back to the study that we did, we basically wanted to understand what are the usage patterns of businesses that are working on AI systems or working on AI applications? How are they using models? How are they engaging with models? If you were to believe media rhetoric and believe the rhetoric that is coming out of the West, that there is so much concentration, there would be no point in undertaking this study, right? But it's absolutely false. Multi-homing, which means usage of different models at the same time, is extremely prevalent. So what we found is that out of 50 companies that we surveyed, 54% of them, multi-home across open source and closed proprietary models, and 74% of them multi-home across the same type of model type. So that means that they're either multi-homing across closed proprietary models or they're multi-homing across open source models. And then a higher percentage of them want to build their own models or are building their own models. And the lowest percentage of them are basically single homing on closed proprietary models. So I think we need to really think about what is happening at home. We need to have empirical data when we're making these assertions and having these conversations, because I don't think it leads anywhere when we kind of, base our decisions, I would say, on global assumptions that are kind of grounded in political rhetoric or grounded in rhetoric that is, somewhat has a vested interest involved. Last point on standards. Again, this is a study that we did. The problem with standards or the way global standards, I agree with Jhalak that yes, it is global standards bodies are completely dominated by the Chinese. We've seen it in telecom, and it is to some extent prevalent in AI standards as well. But I think there's another problem in AI standards, and that problem is that there is a belief that ethics or the translation of ethical principles to standards is the proper way to guide AI governance. And I think that is I don't know, I completely disagree with that direction. And if you talk to any AI engineer, they will say the same. It's a really hard way to solve for governance issues. It is hard to translate ethics into design and product design. It requires a lot of resources. Even the most well-resourced companies get it wrong. The latest example being Gemini and Google, and where they basically overcorrected for racial stereotyping. And I think the other problem with standards, or the way that standards are evolving, particularly when there is this ethical principle, underpinning, is that standards or those principles or the definitions of those principles are being taken from traditional software. So, for instance, the ISO 42001:2023, which is basically the last major standard that came out for AI, that the principle of trustworthiness that has been taken from another standard on trustworthiness, which is from regular software. But regular software is not the same as AI, right? AI is stochastic and non-deterministic, unlike regular software. So how are you importing these principles from a context that is completely divorced from what you are dealing with? And then, of course, there are other problems with ethics, is that they're completely subjective, which means they're completely open to interpretation. And again, they're not particularly useful in guiding, except for maybe the principle of bias. They're not particularly useful in guiding engineers and people on the ground, and particularly smaller companies, on what they have to guard against, what they have to look at. Considering the fact, or caveating for the fact that a lot of them do understand what the problems are. So I think that we need to have a much more nuanced conversation about AI when we're talking about governance. I think we can't be at 30,000 feet, which I think that a lot of conversation still is. And I think that we really need to look at what's happening in our own country and understand that context better before we start having these these zero-sum game conversations that, oh, it's the global south versus the global north. Not at all. I see it as a synergy. I see it as a kind of, there can be a symbiotic relationship between the south and the north in terms of AI development. And I think we need to think about it in those terms a little more.
So thank you, Meghna, for providing a very nuanced understanding, because most of us normally talk in very superficial terms, and you provided the deep dive into the mechanics of AI. And one important point which you mentioned is that any kind of a frontier technology requires funding, and it also requires certain categories of state support. And you also mentioned about the startups getting some kind of a preferential deal, or not a preferential deal, at least a level playing field in this game, even with respect to government procurement for that matter. And you also brought in the element that it is not a game played only by the big tech companies, but there is significant amount of space for innovation and indigenous activity in this area. Very fascinating intervention. So now we have got around 10 minutes for Q&A. So we can have 2 rounds of Q&A. So yeah, please. Also mention your name and
Hi, good morning. My name is Soumya Avasthi. I'm from Observer Research Foundation. My question is open for all the panelists, but I would especially like to listen to what Roshni would like to say on it. You spoke about algorithm, and my question comes from the part of security, national security. A lot of misinformation and disinformation is also happening because there is a problem in our algorithmic study. And that is why we are not able to counter this challenge. So how do you say or think that India can handle this problem? And when you talk about so many kinds of social media applications like TikTok, India was very successful in banning it. But why we have not been able to do anything about other applications like WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal? Because a lot of times these radicalization propaganda takes place on these platforms. And when it comes to the investigation part, we are dependent on the Western companies who are handling these issues. So we have to go through that channel. And like Meghna said, that the trustworthiness factor cannot be similar for each category. Same way, our context, our challenges are very much India centric. So how are we going to handle these? And with startups and brilliant minds like yours in private sector, how are you supporting India in this challenge?
I think we can take a few questions, please. And after that, you.
Hello, my name is Imran Khurshid. I am a visiting research fellow associated with the International Center for Peace Studies, New Delhi. My question is that how India can play an important role in setting the democratic standards for the emerging and critical technologies. Because there are issues with these emerging and critical technologies. The first issue is that these technologies are rapidly evolving. So it makes very difficult to set any governance standards for these technologies. And the second issue is that there is an interlinkage between geopolitics and these technologies. That also makes it, when we have to set any standard, we have to take a comprehensive approach. So and the third issue is that if the democratic countries do not set any standards for these emerging and critical technologies, then the standards will be set by the China. And we know that China has an authoritarian, the standard is that there will be authoritarian, they will be invading of the privacy. So these factors have to be taken into consideration. So this is my question. Thank you.
There is one. Yeah, please.
Good morning. My name is Halini. I was just wondering, my question is open to the panel. I was wondering, when we're talking about regulation, are we looking at Chinese models or models from the non-West countries as the only threat? Because when we're being fed information from any source on the AI models, as we were discussed, all of them seem to have a bias, and that bias comes from the way we look at things, right? So I think as India, when we're talking about India being one of the leading partners in the global south, we would have to look at threat from both sides as an equal problem. What do you think about this?
So I'll take one more question and then we'll have one more session. I think gentleman at the back and then after.
I'm Akshayjyoti Sharma. I'm from OKD Institute of Social Change and Development, Guwahati. My point is that India has a legitimate stake in space technology, and how we can leverage that for a equitable technology in a global forum. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question in this round, we can have one more if there's time.
Myself, Habibullah Ansari from Patna. My question is that if you have technology, you have everything. You can hegemonize the world. So in quest of getting the advanced technology, we have to do realistic assessment. How far India is able to compete the global world in terms of latest technology. It is not a matter of trade, industry, etc., etc. But our government, how it is focusing the government institution in terms of research and development, particularly the Science and Technology Ministry. And what are the other research institutions in India? Why not we focus on that to develop artificial intelligence or whatever the new technology coming to us, instead of unrealistic competition to the world, China, America, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so. We'll close this particular session and then I will ask you to answer the first question with respect to the bias.
Yeah. So thank you for your question. With respect to the misinformation and it being a cause for national security, I completely agree with you. We've already seen what Meta and Facebook has and can do in Myanmar against the Rohingya community, etc. So I think there has to be more smart regulations, which is very, very specific as to what system you going to be it's going to be applied to. The government has to take up the initiative to make better, improved, enhanced regulations. Another aspect that I want to touch upon is the funding for R&D specifically, which is very, very minimal compared to other countries. And I think that is something that the Indian government should really focus on as well.
mean, if anyone would like to answer this particular question.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to it. There's a very different context between the TikTok ban and, it's absolutely absurd to suggest banning Telegram or WhatsApp. With WhatsApp, there are millions of businesses that are dependent on it. Okay, but even from a regulatory standpoint, just understand that the TikTok context is very different, because in the case of China, there's a national intelligence law that requires all companies to be providing intelligence agencies within China data that they're collecting, and that's not only data of Chinese citizens, but any country that they're operating as well. That was like the primary kind of driver behind that. Even in the context of misinformation, I think that we need to be really careful about this big tech obsession, because I think it is driving regulation of any kind of online harm in the wrong direction, where one, you are basically saying that basically because you are the largest, you have the largest user base, and we still believe that virality is a threat, even though many of these companies have undertaken many measures, both ex ante, and when I say ex ante, I mean before the post is put up, or ex post, which means basically take down, many measures to limit virality. And I'm speaking particularly of WhatsApp in this context, where WhatsApp, after the lynchings happened in 2017, 2018, undertook these measures because there was pressure from the government that you need to find a way to limit virality. So what did they do? Now now groups are much smaller. Forwards can only go to 5 people at a time. There's multiple, and of course the size of the file is limited to 2 GB. That way Telegram is actually a little more potent, because virality is you have both you have the capability for publicity as well as operational security, which means that there is encryption, but at the same time you can have channels with unlimited members, so you can kind of spread messages like that. But a lot of the emerging radicalization and problematic content is on smaller, lesser known platforms, and that is across the board. And I think that we really need to again be careful about just thinking about it only in terms of big tech, because what some jurisdictions have done, for instance the EU, they came out with the DSA, and essentially what they did was they turned trust and safety into they relegated it into a compliance function, which means that the government is now dictating what these companies should do in terms of trust and safety, even though trust and safety is a moving target. It's constantly evolving, because bad actors are constantly finding new and innovative ways to carry out harms online. But if you have rigid rules to regulate platforms, then platforms are also going to say, why should we innovate? You tell us what to do. And that's what happened in the EU, where they started firing their trust and safety teams. Lastly, on the context of misinformation alone is not illegal. Misinformation, in addition, which causes some kind of harm or some kind of crime, that is illegal. And I think that is something that is important to be understood, particularly in the context of deepfakes, because when we talk about deepfakes, we don't talk about them, a deepfake, let's say, showing someone in a bad light, a deepfake causing some kind of, translating into some sort of physical harm or being used for fraud. It has to be in connection with some crime. A deepfake per se is not illegal, because if you were to say that a deepfake is illegal per se, then it would make it very easy for any kind of actor to say, no, but it was a real image, or essentially you're basically creating huge problems for free speech. So I think that for instance, it would be very easy for any political actor to say that some disparaging video of them is a deep fake, and it's illegally been put up by some platform. So I think we need to think about these things in very narrow, nuanced terms. And I also think we need to think about very flexible frameworks, because we do need to force platforms to constantly be innovating. And I think that informal sense of pressure is what really plays an important role in that.
Thank you. I think there were a couple of questions with respect to regulation. Should we follow the Chinese model, or should we allow China to? So do you have any kind of comments? Other speakers as well.
Yeah, I think the Chinese model is better, because then I'm talking about their model of regulation, because it's vertical, so it's more specific to the model and to the to the particular context. So I think context-specific regulation is what's needed, which is where standards play a better role, perhaps, because different sectoral uses, different models present different considerations. The other the other model is the EU model, which again we've seen is not particularly a useful template because it lacks proportionality as well as granularity. So how it lacks proportionality is that, let's say in a world outside AI, if you have a vehicle, it just has to be safe, right? That is the kind of regulatory principle. And if you have credit scoring, it has to be transparent. But in the case of the EU AI Act, both things, whether vehicles or credit scoring, have to both be safe and transparent. So there's an innovation crunch there, which is why a lot of companies are just not releasing their AI products there. And I think that, again, we need to think about what are we kind of regulating for? Can we find a happy medium? So copyright, again, because there are a lot of creators in the EU, they've said that no, there needs to be absolute transparency. But if you make really stringent copyright rules and you don't have like a text and data mining exception, essentially you've foreclosed access for smaller companies to that data. It's not the large companies that are going to face a problem. It's the smaller ones. So I think we need to think about that.
We have only 3 minutes actually, so maybe others.
Yeah. So just catching up with the copyright part, which is very rightly mentioned. The United Kingdom government also came up with an AI and copyright paper in December, right? And honestly, I did a workshop recently in Hyderabad about framework fatigue and AI governance. So too many things coming up. But even if we extend to the copyright example of it, there's an underlying economics about the use of AI. Now, if we take one of the big tech company CEO's statements, Mr. Nadella, who says in Davos, maybe last year he said and this year as well, that AI should be a driver of prosperity and growth, then how should it work out? I think a simple way to go ahead is at least ensure that the underlying economic impact, the network effects, they are properly facilitated, because sometimes network effects can't be completely just jam-packed with anything. For example, if you look at the way AI creators are emerging these days, right? Now, if you look at certain AI-generated content aspects, like even deepfake, when we say deepfake itself is multimodal by all means. It is text plus video plus audio plus other things sometimes. Or sometimes it's very simple. It's just a video with audio. But when we look at the economics of it, what actually shows is that sometimes there are larger players who try to demonetize creators in AI who are using these AI tools, but then also using their editing skills, or they are not. They might be just building on their own, but on platforms like Reddit, they're just demonetized or deplatformed. So I think when it comes to content provenance, again, great idea. It should be done. Labeling is pretty much important. I think it should be in future a safe harbor aspect as well. But then again, we need to look at how really it affects smaller players, because if we don't have MSMEs and startups and AI who actually can innovate and have the space to earn well as well, I think we can't address certain gaps when it comes to economics of AI as well. And I think that itself addresses the questions of regulations in a market sense. I'm not talking about risks, but of course. And just to quickly add on China, I think I completely agree with Meghna on the China part on regulation, because with China, the thing is, in a simple way, I'd say that data and algorithm is completely in their lap when it comes to Chinese data, Chinese people. And DeepSeek R1 became successful, and Kimi also, Qwen 2.5 by Alibaba, because with China, the thing is they actually can take a lot of risks, not just because of population, but because of the resources and things they have. They did it very smartly. But the US is a fragmented proprietary market, which is, well, too self-obsessed. So I think we need to have a unique way to understand our markets in a holistic and helpful way. So yeah.
So we have really seconds.
Yeah, I think there was a question about technology and hegemony. And I think I just want to echo the point that Meghna brought up, that we're in India, one of our core advantages is the fact that, we have large data sets we can leverage within the Indian context. Government being the largest provider of data, And I think we have to unlock the potential of that, because that can really like set us up very well. So I think we have to think about what are our core strengths that we can leverage internally to, you know, catapult us ahead.
Thank you. So thank you all the panelists. In fact, our time is up, but this is an extremely important topic with a huge amount of dimension from the technology side, from the democratic side as well, because a large number of people who might be impacted by AI cannot even figure out what it is. So it is an extremely important topic. I really would like to thank Observer Research Foundation and for the organizers in particular for arranging this discussion. Thank you, and kudos to all the speakers. Thank you.